The last time I was here, I got in a taxi and there was an open basket of marijuana on the back seat. And I said to the taxi driver, "Excuse me, sir, do you happen to know that you have an open basket of marijuana back here?" And he says, "Yeah, well, there were two guys came in, they had that. We came to a red light, and there was a police car, and they jumped out and ran away." I said, "Okay, that's really interesting. What are you going to do with this basket of marijuana open sitting in your car? Do you maybe think you should take it to the police?" And he said, "Thinking about it." I promise you this wouldn't happen in Ottawa. I could just promise you this doesn't happen in Ottawa. I always know when I'm here when there are people talking in trees and open baskets of marijuana in taxis. So I'm thrilled to be here tonight. And as you know, your Capital Regional District of Greater Victoria is set to do a very important thing. And that very important thing is long overdue, and that is it's going to stop dumping its sewage in the ocean just after preliminary filtering, much to the relief, I'm sure, of our neighbors to the south. And let's get something straight right away, because I know there are those who say that this isn't necessary. This is a very, very good thing, and don't listen to anyone who says it is not. We humans have been using the ocean to dump our garbage in for centuries, and if we think that there's no damage, you need go no further than a book called Seasick by Alana Mitchell. The oceans are probably the next place we're going to have to turn our attention to. We just think we can deal with one problem by ruining another or creating another, and we cannot. But this board, the CRD board, also has a very important decision to make, which is whether to maintain public control over this new wastewater facility or turn it into a public-private partnership, which, of course, is being urged by both the federal and provincial governments. In fact, the Harper government is basically now saying that they're going to give preferential treatment to any infrastructure development and funding anywhere in the country as long as it looks at public-private partnerships first, and then they have to show why they didn't choose that. And the BC government has ordered CRD to work with the provincial agency that's called Partnerships BC that promotes public-private partnerships here. And so, since the board is looking at a three-way split for the funding for this project, it's pretty clear they're under a lot of pressure. I'm going to say tonight that this would be a terrible mistake for this community to make, but I want to start, before I start talking about Victoria, I just want to go out in the world a little bit and remind us what we're dealing with. First of all, we have a global water crisis. Now, we hear about water being impacted by climate change, by greenhouse emission fueled climate change, and that's true in terms of the melting glaciers, the snowpacks melting, the quicker evaporation of our waterways, and so on. What we don't hear as much of, and one of the reasons I'm going to Copenhagen in December, is to try to get the notion that when we displace water from where it has been put by nature, we create desert. And we are massively displacing water from aquifers and rivers and lakes. We're taking it to green deserts to grow crops that don't belong there. We're taking water, land-based water systems, and we're pumping them into big cities, and when those big cities are through with them, they dump them in the ocean as garbage. I'm working with some scientists in Slovakia who estimate that we're probably dumping about 170 trillion liters of land-based water into the ocean as garbage every single year. This is not water that naturally flows into the ocean. So as we create desert, we heat up the land, the hydrologic cycle, affecting the hydrologic cycle, and creating more global warming. And so what we know is that at the moment, about 2 billion people live in areas of the world that do not have enough water, but they're not experiencing cyclical drought. These are areas that are actually running out of water, and that by 2025, fully 2/3 of the world's population is going to be living with some level of water crisis. Could not exaggerate the crisis that we're dealing with. Mumbai, India, excuse me, this is just too many planes. the old Bombay. They're not sure how many people, maybe 18 million. Well over half now live on the streets. They're running out of water. They've hit the bottom of their water table. And I talked to some Indian scientists at a conference I was at recently, and they said they only think they have about a year's worth of water there. I can't even think about what that's going to mean and what they're going to do. So as a result of these declining supplies, we're up against a dramatically growing demand for something that we absolutely need for life. A great contest is taking place in the world between those who see water as a commodity to be put on the open market for sale, and those of us who see it as a human right, public trust, a commons, part of our commons, and something that belongs to the earth and other species as well. And the question is fast becoming, who is going to set the rules for access to water in this world of declining water sources, and upon what set of principles? On one side, you have the World Bank, you have the World Trade Organization, you have parts of the United Nations, you have many of our northern governments, including our own, and certainly the United States. We'll see under Obama how different it will be than it was under George Bush. Many of the European countries. We have a whole group now of new economists and water experts who are now telling us that the only future for water has to be a market-based future. And that if we put water on the open market for sale like running shoes or Coca-Cola, the market mechanism will take care of supply and demand. On the other hand, on the other side is a huge movement, a growing movement. We call ourselves water warriors, or a global social justice movement, water justice movement. And we are fighting very hard to maintain the fundamental principle that no one should be allowed to appropriate water for personal profit while someone else dies or watches their child dies from lack of water. Now, the forms of privatization, I've got about 6 fundamental forms that I think we need to look at. The first is the one that we're dealing with here in Victoria, and that is the whole issue of services, water delivery and wastewater treatment. And we have a number of big corporations, water utilities. The biggest in the world are Veolia and Suez from France. And they have moved all through the global south, pushed by the World Bank, that went into these countries and said, if you want funding, you're going to have to take these private companies. And so there have been massive experiments in privatization in the global south. They operate on what's called full cost recovery, which means that they have to get every cent of their investment back, plus 15 to 20% over that for their shareholders. Their record is terrible and documented very well. They always cut employees, and generally by about 50%. They raise rates, they cut standards, and they deny water to the poor. And this is just standard across the global south. And increasingly, as we're seeing them move into the global north, we're being able to document this as well. There's a huge fight back against these corporations in the global south and more recently in the global north. I remember standing in a place called, in La Paz, in a subsidiary or a suburb, thank you, of La Paz, and in Bolivia, which is one of the poorest countries in Latin America, and one still indigenous, about 85% indigenous. And the company Suez had got the contract to bring water and wastewater services, and they had promised to put in really good wastewater treatment, and they didn't. They just dug a bunch of canals and threw the garbage and the sewage into the canals that went through people's homes and right into Lake Titicaca. And I actually stood downstream from an abattoir where they were throwing the raw animal parts and so on, and a child had fallen in this river of poison the week before and had died. This is what they consider to be wastewater treatment. Very excitingly, when Evo Morales became president a couple of years ago, one of the first things he did was tell Suez to leave, and it did. Suez was just kicked out of Atlanta, Georgia. Suez was just kicked out of Atlanta, Georgia 2 years ago, in just after 3 years of a 20-year contract, because the water coming out of people's taps was putrid and the rates had risen dramatically. The most exciting of these that we're very, very happy about is that Paris, which has never had a public system and has always had these two companies under a different name running their water system on a for-profit basis, has announced that when their contracts come up at the end of 2011, they're moving to a public system, and they're actually going to have to bring people in to teach them how to do this. But this notion of water services being permanently run by private companies is very much a part of the scenario. And Suez and Veolia want to they want to double their output now within the next 10 years, and they're looking towards North America. The second form of privatization is bottled water. At a very conservative estimate, we probably drink about 250 billion liters of water every year around the world, creating terrible pollution, creating a great deal of garbage, using a great deal of energy, creating greenhouse gas emissions. The statistics are stunning. Draining individual aquifers, because these companies set up a plant, so they don't want to move around. So they find an aquifer or a spring and they set up a plant and drain it till it's dry. I call it water mining. They are making people dependent around the world on private water, taking advantage of the places that public water isn't clean or safe. And we've been fighting these bottled water companies all over the world. We're chasing them everywhere. Most exciting was a fight against Coca-Cola that's going on all over India, because Coke uses the satellite imagery from the American military to find out where the water sources are, and then they set up a plant, particularly if they're in a tribal or poor indigenous community. And one community was Pachamada, in a little village, a little tribal village in the south of India called Kerala. And they set up a huge plant and put up, you got to start thinking of water sources as being like fortresses. They put up these armed guards and great big iron gates, and they have dogs. And I mean, they will shoot you if you try to get in. And they took the water, drained it till it was dry in the community. But the women went on a 3-year vigil and sat across from the Coca-Cola plant and got such sympathy in India that lawyers came and scientists came. They started testing the water tables and took it to the Supreme Court, and Coca-Cola was forced to leave Pachamada 2 years ago. We're also seeing the privatization of water through cleanup technology. Now, I know there's a place for cleanup technology. I absolutely understand that, but I think we need to be very clear that it serves the greater notion and the greater principle of water as a public good. What I found in my research, however, is that great big corporations like General Electric are setting up a water division, putting billions and billions of dollars into this very heavy chemically based technology. We've now got nanotechnology looking at water cleanup as well. And then needing a steady supply of dirty water in order to continue to make money. It's kind of like incinerators, the whole theory around, well, why don't we burn our garbage? Well, you'll just need more garbage, because once they've built those incinerators, they need more garbage. It becomes its own need. And I'm very concerned about the growth in desalination plants around the world. There are 25 to 30 planned along the California coast. A new study from the Middle East shows that which has the most desal plants in the world, shows that the ocean, the salt level in the ocean is becoming very dangerous, because what they do is they take the water out. They also use a chemical for this reverse osmosis, and what they throw back into the ocean is a very intensive salt brine, the dead aquatic life that they sucked in, and this chemical, and it creates these dead zones, which have been identified around Australia now, which is also turning to desalination, but very clearly changing the level of safety in the water systems where these plants are intensive. The latest is that they want to set up nuclear-powered desalination plants, and a number of the new desal plants are in fact going to be fueled by nuclear power. And we now have water on the stock exchange. We have water indexes. The water indexes are outperforming regular stock exchange indexes by 500%. It is the hottest stock in the world right now, is water. Then we have something called virtual water. You're going to hear a lot more about virtual water over the next few years. Virtual water is the water that is needed to grow a commodity or make a product that you then ship away, and then it's called virtual water trade. And so much water is being traded around the world this way that it may as well be moving around in pipelines. Americans are stunned when I tell them that every single day, a full third of their daily water use is not only transported out of watersheds, but is actually exported right out of the country. Australia, which is a country I've come to love and have been to many times and am very worried about, has taken this to an extreme. They've built their entire economic prosperity, and it's a very prosperous, very urban, very sophisticated country, on draining the Murray-Darling River to grow commodities for export. So rice and cotton and wine. Of course, everybody loves the Australian wines. It's destroying the Murray-Darling. And the Murray-Darling no longer reaches the ocean. I flew over it in a helicopter a few months ago, and you can see it literally dying from the mouth up, and absolutely all the wetlands, all the animals, all the aquatic life, everything going in its wake. But the government will not give up this way of seeing water as a resource to make it wealthy, and is continuing to over-extract mercilessly. You have to look at what's called the water footprint of a country, and the question is, where do you get the water that is used for all the goods and services that you use? People say to me often, well, what's a place in the world that's doing well? And I say, well, Europe, yes and no. Europe is taking care of its own water. It's got good watershed management, cooperation, agreements between the countries, and so on. But they do it by importing water in the form of this virtual water from other places. So Great Britain, for instance, imports 2/3 of its water. Japan imports almost all of its water in that form, not as water per se, but virtual water. I was in Kenya 2 years ago, and I went to the Rift Valley, and I had the privilege of going onto this beautiful lake called Lake Naivasha. And we went on an old boat, and there was an old boatman was standing up, and he kind of paddled with very great dignity. He stood and paddled us the whole time. Has the last wild hippopotamus herd in East Africa. And very exciting, but he would say, they're dangerous, so we can't get too near. But I looked up at an island at one point, and there were pelicans and wildebeests and giraffes, and I said, that just looks like Out of Africa, the movie Out of Africa. And he said, well, that would be because that's where Out of Africa was filmed, right there, You could see Robert Redford landing, and you could see Meryl Streep waiting for him. And well, what they've done with Lake Naivasha is they have surrounded it with the rose agribusiness, roses as in flowers, because it takes a lot of water to grow roses. And so if you buy roses in Europe or Great Britain, chances are they were made in Lake Naivasha. And the Lake Naivasha is dying. The companies there are already planning their move. They know that within 5 to 10 years that lake will be gone. It was a traditional lake of the Maasai people. And there was a famous filmmaker, Joan Root, who was murdered trying to protect this lake. It's an incredibly rich and tragic history, but it's the story all over Africa. And there are now 677 major lakes in Africa in crisis. Every single one of their 677 lakes is in crisis. But you don't have to go so far. We can look to the tar sands in northern Alberta, and we could argue that the water that is being destroyed there, and for every unit of heavy oil they extract, they destroy 3 to 5 units of water. One could consider that water to be a form of virtual water, the water that's needed to produce this energy. And by the way, we have a legal opinion that shows that the American energy companies operating in northern Alberta actually can claim ownership of that water. And if the government of Alberta were to say, well, we're going to cut your level in half, or we're concerned about this, or you have to clean it up or whatever, they could actually sue for financial compensation because the government would have changed the terms of the agreement. The fifth way that we're creating the privatization of water is something new, but it's really happening quite fast, and it's water markets, water trading, water banks, and this is the whole notion of putting water on the stock exchange like a commodity. Chile probably has gone the furthest, and this is a part of the Pinochet legacy. They actually have public auctions for water, and big Canadian mining companies go down there and they outbid local farmers, local indigenous peoples for the water, and they can literally then own it and do what they want with it. There are places in Chile, places in India where big companies are buying up whole sets of whole water systems, whole watersheds. Australia unilaterally changed their law in 1994 and said we're going to create water rights, and they gave the right to the water that was being used to all these big cotton and rice and wine conglomerates. They gave so many away that there are now 80% more water rights permits than water that exists in the Murray-Darling system, which creates a nightmare. So now the government, desperate to try to save the Murray-Darling, is trying to buy those water rights back, but the companies are saying, well, we're going to set the price, and they're setting it outside the ability of the government to buy it back. The latest thing that happened is that a big investment consortium, there's these big investment pools going around the world looking for things to invest in, have started buying up water rights in Australia, just as I predicted when I was there about 5 years ago, and said, you know, you're not going to be able to keep this in private Australian hands. It's going to go from public to private to global private, and sure enough, it's happening. As I say, excuse me, this is just not a cold, no H1N1, this is just too many planes. And Spain has just set up a water bank where you can actually go and put virtual water, in this case, you know, we have this many rights in a bank, and you can trade and negotiate that way. And then we have the last one, and worrying me very much, is something you're going to hear more about again, is called land grabs. And this is the practice where countries that know they're going to run out of food and water are buying up tracts of land in poor countries to try to get access or to gain access to permanent land and water rights. The two countries that are doing this the most are India and China, and they're buying huge tracts of land all through Africa for this purpose. You'd be not surprised to know that the Globe and Mail recently had an editorial just yesterday saying that wouldn't it be a great thing if Canada's provinces would change their ownership laws and allow this kind of land grab to happen in Canada. So put together these, excuse me, these practices increasingly backed by a very strong campaign now with economists and so-called environmentalists and so-called water experts are out there telling us that the market solution is the only way forward. And in my opinion, this forms a very dangerous trend where we may find water all over the world controlled by private corporations and private interests. If this happens, we're going to find that we have no way to protect source water, and there will be no incentive to protect source water because nobody will be looking after it. And the one thing we know we have to do is stop polluting water, both surface water and groundwater. Martin Luther King said, legislation may not change the heart, but it will restrain the heartless. If we allow the corporate control of water, nature is going to have to fend for itself, and already we're seeing an assault on groundwater and wilderness all over the world. We're diverting and displacing water from watersheds at an alarming rate. I was in a debate at Northwestern University in Chicago last year, and I was the only one on a panel of about 7 people who was not in favor of water markets. And when I challenged about, well, who is going to preserve water for nature, how are we going to do that? One of the economists said, well, I think we should trust groups like Ducks Unlimited to protect nature. But, you know, we're not going to wait quite that long. I don't know if you know, but the government of Ecuador has just brought in the first law in the world, basically naming nature's rights and water and other parts of nature as having fundamental rights. And if we allow the corporate control of water, it's going to go to those who can pay for it and not to those who need it. And this is a very, very important concept for us to understand. If we start to allow the water, commercial exports of our water in Canada, it's going to go to Las Vegas. It's going to go to relieve the water crisis in the Colorado. It is not going to go to those children who every 8 seconds of which one dies. It's not going to go to the places that it's needed because it will become a commercial commodity controlled by large corporations on a for-profit basis, and they have to, of course, compete in that way. So what we're saying is that water must be declared to be a public trust and a human right, and that no one must be denied access to water on the basis of an inability to pay. Now, if you think this is just the global south where this is the problem, it's not. 2 years ago in Detroit, Michigan, they turned the water services to 42,000 families off, most of them African American, many elderly people, because they simply could not pay their water rates. So we moved to a system like this, and there is no reason to think that with the great division between rich and poor in our country, the greatest we've had in 70 years and growing, that we're not going to have an underclass here in our country as well, where we're going to say you can buy it or you cannot have it. Nor are we immune to these problems in Canada. And just to go back to some of the issues that I just raised, let's look at them in Canada. We drink, and this again, a very conservative estimate, about 2.5 billion liters of water in plastic bottles every year. And the plastics industry itself says we only recycle about 35% of that. Alberta has become the first province in the country to introduce water markets. So it's started here in Canada. And the first one of these big buys of water rights was a big resort casino gambling place, and that's the first bid on through the water rights system in Alberta. We also have the Economic Institute of Montreal, a very respected, not by me, but by lots of people, institute in Quebec that is aggressively promoting water exports of Quebec's water supplies on a commercial basis, and we have not heard Premier Charest say that he would not do this. He's been silent. As I say, the Globe and Mail is now advocating that we start opening up our, what did they call it? Something like our empty lands. In other words, we're all becoming urbanized and we've got all this wasted land, or as one forestry executive called it a few years ago, decadent wilderness, which should be put to good use, and we could put it to good use by allowing these land grabs. So the Globe and Mail said, now we should bring the rule of law to it. I mean, we need to bring some rules in, and then we'll support it. And they actually are calling, in the name of free trade, for the provinces to drop any kind of protections against this kind of invasion. And as stated earlier, the Harper government is totally committed to these 3P projects, public-private partnerships, as are many of the provinces. And now we're beginning to see provinces influencing the municipalities in this way. We now have Winnipeg has just turned its water and wastewater services over to a 3P. We fought very hard. We almost won, and we're not giving up. We're just saying we're going to move to the next city council and try to get it revoked. And then finally, in terms of the concerns I have about Canada, I want to tell you about a new trade agreement on the horizon you probably have not heard about. In my opinion, it is the most dangerous trade agreement we have ever talked about negotiating in this country, ever. It's called the Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. It was initiated at a dinner put on by the Power Corporation in Quebec and Premier Jean Charest and the President of France, Sarkozy, 2 years ago, and they started talking about why don't we bypass the United States because, it didn't seem to be happening, and just have this bilateral. But it is galloping very fast now. 2 weeks ago, there were several hundred European negotiators in Ottawa, and a number of us were briefed on a call by the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. They said it's moving very fast, and they're hoping to have a signed deal by 2011. Now, here's what we're worried about. We're worried because the European Union has said we will only negotiate if you open up what was left out of NAFTA, which is what's called subnational procurement. That's all of the public spending at other levels but the federal level. So that's provinces, municipalities, universities, school boards, hospitals, water services, environmental services, social services, absolutely everything that we spend the bulk of our money on. The federal procurement outside of defense is $5 billion. We think we're talking close to $200 billion in terms of subnational procurement. And they're coming at it through both the Harper government's offer to Obama to get out of the Buy American provisions. He's saying, we'll open up our provinces, municipalities. They're looking at listing the provinces now with the World Trade Organization agreement on procurement, which would open it up to everyone. We do know now that they're in a hurry to get an agreement among all the provinces to really have that, finally have what they want, which is that the provinces will agree to come under the discipline of international trade rules. And they want the TILMA concept of having the right to have corporations sue another province if they find that they're bumping into higher standards, they want that to be national. And that has been stated clearly at the most recent meeting of the Agreement on Internal Trade. The reason they're doing that is that the European Union has said also, besides that they want access to that subnational level of contracting, they have also said they want to have all of that harmonized before the final agreement. They don't want to have to bump into different standards. So this is going to mean that not only will corporations have the right in Canada to challenge higher standards, but we're now going to have European service companies coming in, not only being able to compete equally with public services, and that's the agreement, that's where they're going, and they've said it openly, but also to challenge any law, practice, policy, standard, regulation that we set up for our communities, from fair trade to green jobs, and saying you're going to give you funding for energy conversion, but we want you to create local employment, to employment for First Nations people. Any of that kind of thing is going to be challengeable. And you should know that under NAFTA's most favored nation provision, that anything new we give to in another agreement to another country or their corporations, we have to give to American corporations, because that's the agreement in NAFTA. So all of the private service companies, like the big health companies, are going to have the right to start to compete and access that money as well. Now, the concern I have around water, of course, is that the two biggest water corporations in the world, Suez and Veolia, both come from France, and the biggest bottled water company, Nestle, comes from Switzerland. So we have these three big European water companies that are extremely excited, apparently, about this agreement and have been working with the European negotiators on it. And I am very, very worried about it. And I think that when we take a look at what we're doing here and what we're discussing here tonight, we need to see it against that background. So as you can see, I feel very strongly that the decision that Victoria makes in the next few months is extremely important, not just for the people of Greater Victoria and British Columbia and even Canada, but I would argue for people struggling for the right to water here in Canada and around the world. If the 3P water services are allowed here, it's going to become a standard across the country, and I think that then we'll see other provinces being able to be forced to allow the same kind of public-private partnerships under the new Agreement on Internal Trade. Additionally, I would argue that the board here has to consider a few other things. First, private-public partnership is a private undertaking, no matter what they say, and the company, using the same amount of investment, must find enough money to pay not only the exorbitant salaries and benefits of their CEOs and their senior staff, but enough money to pay their investors. And they have to make profit. So something has to go. They either have to cut corners or raise rates or lay off workers or all three. Private companies financing public projects also pay higher interest rates on what they borrow and therefore require a higher rate of return from their investment. That's just a fact. They don't get the same kind of deal that a public sector does when it borrows. An analysis by forensic accountants Ron Parks and Roseanne Terhart found that other forms of PPPs in this province were much more expensive than public services. These costs are going to be borne over many years by the taxpayers and the ratepayers of this area, not by the other levels of government who are proposing it and promoting it so hard. And private utility providers are known to use their contracts with stable public services like they would use it here to go out and promote their interests in other parts of the world. The city of Adelaide in South Australia is suing the Veolia subsidiary there because this company has used its very high rates in Adelaide to promote its interests in the global south, and they've found a direct connection, are actually suing them. And finally, it's much, much harder to hold a private company accountable in the same way that you hold a public utility accountable. Public utilities are subject to public scrutiny. Private companies avoid it like the plague. And there's an important environmental dimension to this because a public system can and must be required to integrate resource recovery and waste reuse towards the goal of environmental sustainability as a condition of operation, and it can do that because it's not for profit. A private water company is going to avoid this if possible. And you should know that the private water companies in Great Britain have year after year after year been named as the worst polluters in Great Britain. Simply put, there is absolutely no redeeming feature to a public-private partnership for this plant and absolutely no reason for us to consider it. Instead, the people of this area must join in the global social movement, so water justice movement, join the water warriors of the world to say that nobody owns water, that water belongs to the earth, it belongs to other species, it belongs to future generations, it belongs to all of us equally in the sense of having equitable access. It's a human right. And it must not be allowed to be privatized in the way that it is happening around the world bit by bit by bit. Every time any one of us stops it, any time we put down a bottle of water and turn to that public tap water and make sure that we want to know that it's clean and safe and that we're going to invest in it because that's what we want, as a value, that's what we want to do. Every time we conserve water, every time we stop someone from polluting water, every time we fight for each person's right to water and the dignity that brings, then we're part of a global movement that's going to change the world, I really do believe. I have this vision, two visions, of where we could go. Woody Allen says, well, there's two futures for the world. One path leads us to total annihilation and destruction, and the other to despair and the end of the world. And, he says, let's hope we choose the right one, have the grace to. But actually, we do have a scenario of conflict around water. We have a scenario of conflict where large countries like the United States and China are looking outside of their borders for water security, for new supplies, and that's going to change the geopolitics of the world. We have conflicts between rich and poor, between the global south and the global north, but within social classes within the global south. I mean, I can remember standing in a place called Orange Farm, one of the townships in Johannesburg, and I mean, poverty as far as you can see, burning tires and burning garbage and pit latrines and kids with no shoes and rats in the gutter. But finally, there's a pipe bringing the miracle of water up to a little row of shanties. There's a pipe and a tap, but between the pipe and the tap is a state-of-the-art water meter. And the only way you can get water out of that thing is to take a key, an electronic key, go pay for it, touch the meter, and then you see every single drop of water being registered. I stood with a water warrior, Brix Mokolo, his name is, and he said, it gives new meaning to the words water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. So of course what they do is they cannot afford it, so they take their bags and the women walk 5 hours to find water, and they bring home water that's poisoned. And so all of the diseases that we had once eradicated, including the plague, are coming back. This is the reality that we're facing in many, many, many parts of the world. And so every time you say no to that vision, that water is only for those who can afford it, you're part of being a very, very different future for water. So I see those conflicts. I see the conflicts between private and public, and I see the conflicts between great big cities that are slurping up the waters of the countryside, moving into indigenous communities around the world, putting up fortresses, armed fortresses, and taking their water. But the other vision is that water could become nature's gift to us, to teach us how to live with one another in peace and more lightly on our earth. I think of the comet movies, you know, where there's a comet coming to the Earth and all of a sudden all the differences that we have don't matter very much because it's going to all be over in 72 hours, and they send Tom Cruise up, and I always think, send the wife, send the baby, you know, leave them up there. But it is a comet. I mean, we have several comets. Elizabeth May would tell you we have the climate crisis comet. We have this water comet. The private sector answer to these is not the right one. We're going to Copenhagen. You know what's going to happen in Copenhagen? There are going to be big corporate interests and big, first world interests and powerful voices saying, look, we can have it all. We can have globalization. We can have unlimited growth. We can have more money. We can have more stuff and bigger ships and bigger planes. We can do it all and make money. We can make money out of this carbon trading. It's a $3 trillion business, and we can reduce carbon emissions, and we can have our cake and eat it too. And there are going to be those of us who are going to be there saying it's not sustainable. What we're doing to the land, what we're doing to the water, what we're doing to the fish, what we're doing to the trees, what we're doing to the air is not sustainable. And we have to move back to a more sane way of living. Will we still trade? I had a young student the other night say to me, well, what about, is it wrong for us to send maple syrup to Florida and for them to send oranges here? And I said, of course not. Nobody's saying there's not going to be trade, but we're not going to put trade in the center of our lives and build agreements that have the only agreements on earth that actually have enforcement mechanisms to say that you can't maintain standards and you can't have local democratic control and you can't build the kind of societies and move towards local food production and local sustainable systems of working and living and growing our food. You can't have that because we have another vision, and by the way, we're going to make money from it. So I find this to be an incredible opportunity for us to put out another voice, another way of looking at this. John Ralston Saul says we are transiting eras, and I love this concept. We are transiting eras. How dare they give us these new trade agreements based on the same old model of more growth? They're talking about expanding the ports here, expanding the ports in Halifax, more good, more stuff, when we all know that whole model isn't sustainable and will be collapsing. How dare they not have some humility and say, you know, what we can see that maybe this notion of unregulated trade and investment and smallest amount of government possible and what I call savage capitalism, you know, they're not only saying we're not sorry, they're saying take more of the medicine that made you sick in the first place. Well, my definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and thinking that it's going to have a different result. They're not learning. The Harper government has not learned one thing. And the premiers of most of our provinces have not learned one thing from the financial collapse. If anything, it's just they put the blinders on and it's do the same, do it more, and it's not sustainable. And we're going to see it first in water, because water is the first face of climate change. When you hear about climate change refugees, they're water refugees. They're people who don't have water to drink. They don't have water to cook with. They don't have water for their children, for health care. There's even a rising violence against women. I went to a seminar in one of the Global South areas that I visited. Now, they're talking about how women go out to find water, can't find it, come home, and then the cycle continues. We can break that cycle. We can absolutely break this cycle. We know exactly what we need. We need to conserve. We need to go the soft path. We need to name water a fundamental human right. We have to take care of it in our watersheds, and we're going to have to move to a deglobalized system. My friend Maude Barlow calls it deglobalization, and we are moving in that direction. So we have to have courage right now. And I have to tell you, it's 10 years after Seattle. I got tear gassed in Seattle. I loved it. I miss it. I miss our spunk. We've lost some spunk, guys. We used to be very saucy. When Michael Wilson, the finance and trade minister, decided to launch NAFTA after the first fight on free trade, and he held a big press conference, we all came in and we had T-shirts on, and we had jackets over them. And just as he went to give his announcement, we all surrounded him and opened our jackets, and the T-shirt said, it was NAFTA down this way, not another F trade agreement. I mean, we had some fun. We have become too polite, in my opinion. When the future of the earth and the future of our children hangs in the balance as it does now, and when there are the kinds of decisions that have to be taken in Copenhagen, and when our government goes and tells us ahead of time, don't have any expectations, because we may only come up with a plan to come up with a plan, maybe at some undisclosed time, it's not good enough. It's just not good enough. Saying no to a public-private partnership for the wastewater facility for this community may not seem to be, you may seem small compared to what we have to do in Copenhagen, but it is an essential piece of it. It truly, truly is. We have to take the environmental and ecological crisis and the human crisis, and we have to put them together, both in our analysis and in our solution. We cannot look at the environment as if we don't live in it, and we cannot deal with the reality, the desperation of the people who are doing without if we don't have a clean environment. I mean, there's no such thing as the right to water if there's no water. And so we need to understand, and that's my biggest criticism of the Millennium Goals, of the Millennium Development Goals of the UN, is that they talk about hooking up half of the people currently without water access now, hooking them up by pipeline to more groundwater sources. We don't have the groundwater sources. There are 24 million bore wells going 24/7 in India, just pumping that water up too fast. We've got to change the way we treat the environment. We've got to stop looking at it as an economic set of economic resources for our prosperity and see it as a living ecosystem of which we are a part. So I just want to end with my two favorite quotes. One is from the wonderful late, great Carl Sagan, who said this. He said, "Anything that you are interested in is not going to happen if you cannot breathe the air and drink the water. Don't sit this one out. Do something. You are, by accident of fate, alive at an absolutely critical moment in the history of our planet." And the other is a Tolkien quote. I toured the tar sands when we had our annual general meeting here last year, Neil, in Edmonton, and then held a press conference and called the tar sands Canada's Mordor. Because when you fly over it or you drive through it and you stop and you look at it and you realize we've taken down a boreal forest the size of Greece and there's nothing living as far as you can see, and there's just big dead lagoons of poison water. And the people in Fort Chipewyan have bile duct cancer in 4-year-olds. You know that something is profoundly wrong. And one of the energy executives said, "Well, it's not as bad as Mordor." And I thought, I won. What do you mean not as bad? It's not as bad as the death of nature. Well, that's good. It's half the death of nature. So I want to just end, and we're going to have a chance to chat, but I want to end the formal part of this with this lovely quote. It's Gandalf, and he's facing this night when Mordor may take over, when all good things, all living things may die. And he's talking about being a steward, and I think I'm in a room full of stewards here, so I would want to share this with you. He says, "The rule of no realm is mine, but all worthy things that are in peril, as the world now stands, those are my care. And for my part, I shall not wholly fail in my task if anything passes through this night that can still grow fair or bear fruit and flower again in the days to come. For I too am a steward. Did you not know?" Thank you. Clearly, the deal is European service companies get access to Canadian contracts, schools, universities, water services, etc. Canadians get a new place to send our raw resources. It's very clear that's the deal. And it has been stated by the Harper government that a good side product will be that we can use this as a tool to knock down Europe's concerns and blocking of our genetically engineered exports and our hormone-laced beef. So the Europeans have much higher standards on food. And so the quid pro quo from our side is, well, we'll open up the subnational governments and I know they've said it, that the desire on the Canadian part is to open up those markets for Canadian genetically engineered food, beef, and so on. So we have a lot of allies if we can find them. Nobody knows this has been happening, and the reason nobody knows it's been happening, there's two reasons. One is that the media isn't telling us. When you read about it, if you ever read about it, it's stuck in the business section of the Globe and Mail or the National Post. When the CBC announced it, Neil MacDonald said it was the best thing since sliced bread. Isn't this going to be great? There was no critical eye placed on it. It's been talked about on Sunday morning program on CBC. On the House, there has been no critical voice on the CBC nor in any major newspaper to date, although we're beginning to change that. We've got some op-eds coming out. So that's one reason you're not reading it or knowing about it, because you're not reading about it. The other reason is that the governments do not want us talking about these trade agreements, either this, the interprovincial, or the Buy American, what we've offered to get out of the Buy American provisions. And they learned this with NAFTA, and so when the Security and Prosperity Partnership for North America came along, you'll note it didn't go to the legislatures of the three countries, and they just kept it as low-key as they could. And we met with the senior bureaucrats from the embassy, American Embassy 2 years ago, and I said to them, why did the Security and Prosperity Partnership for North America not go to the three countries for ratification? And he said, because they and the business communities didn't want another bruising NAFTA battle. That's the term they used. And I said, in other words, you thought you'd lose. And he said, yeah, maybe. They know that when we find out what's in these agreements, that we win the hearts and minds of Canadians and other people around the world. So they're trying to keep this at a very bureaucratic level. At an uninteresting level, they give it an uninteresting title. They think they're going to bore us all to death. But I'm telling you here, you're hearing it tonight, we are launching with CUPE and a number of other organizations around the country. We are organizing for the Canada-European Union Comprehensive Trade and Economic Agreement, CETA, it's called. Get used to it, say the words, look it up, go into our website, canadians.org. We've done some analysis. Stephen Schreibman, our lawyer, is doing work, as is Scott Sinclair. CUPE's doing some really important research. We're beginning to get our act together on this, and we've got to move very quickly because the government's moving full speed ahead, and it is going to, and anything that European Union service companies get in terms of access to our schools, hospitals, water services, etc., American services companies get as well. You need to remember this. It's not, people say, well, Europe's got better standards, isn't that better? No, it's not about standards. It's about pulling down the standards on both in Canada and in Europe, but also opening up access to both European and American private service companies. And then in terms of Victoria, and how to, with the public-private partnership, no, technically they don't own the water. This is how they tout it as being good, because there have been experiments in the world, starting with Margaret Thatcher, where she actually sold the actual water to the companies, and they owned the water system itself. So they could make total decisions around what happened to it. She said, that's your water, you buy it, you decide what to do with it. There was such an outcry over that now they say, well, this is the best of both worlds. You get the public holding control of the water, but the efficiency of the private market delivering it. That's supposed to be the model. It's just privatization by any other name, because once you've signed the contract, you've signed with a for-profit company that has to get its money back. And it has to get its money back by charging high enough rates that it makes investment profit for its shareholders. And they do that over many, many years. So instead of, biting the bullet and putting some money up front into a project like this, or infrastructure repair or whatever, and then saying, okay, that's it, it's done, you're paying for years and years and years. And what they typically do is they go back to governments and they say, gee, we don't know how we could have miscalculated so badly, but we really need to renegotiate this contract. That is, I promise you, standard. The other thing that's standard is that they like to keep the contract secret so that you don't know, the public has no access to know. And I think you should be demanding to know from the consultants that have been hired the status of the report on procurement here. I'm not opposed to thinking about ways to fund public water systems. I don't think pricing isn't necessarily privatization. I prefer to do it through taxation, but we do have to find ways to pay for the actual delivery of that water. Some communities go to block situation where for a basic amount of water, you don't pay at all, or you pay so little it doesn't matter, but that if you're abusive of water, then they might raise rates. And certainly the model that I like is the one that I helped bring in Vermont. Vermont is a state that has a lot of groundwater. They had a lot of big companies, including a lot of bottled water companies, coming in, taking up huge amounts of water and just shipping it away. And they had no protection. So 2 years ago, they passed a law that said that their groundwater is a public trust and therefore doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to all Vermonters, the ecosystem, and the future. And so everyone has a certain amount of access to, access to a certain amount of water. And if you're going to use more than a certain amount, and this would be mostly for commercial use, there's going to be a permit. So they now have a permit system, and then you pay for it. So there's a commercial charge for this water, and the government can step in and say you're polluting or you're using too much or whatever. So the control remains with the public trust. It's a really important step, and Quebec is looking at a similar law. Manitoba's looking at a similar law, and we need to start proposing these kind of really positive visions. Where we work with CUPE and the Council of Canadians, we've got something we call Blue Communities, and it's a vision that we want communities to work to, supporting water as a public trust, as a public service, and protecting tap water, basically, and protecting your source water. So I think we need to be putting forward a vision that we see, in a positive way. So it's not that we're not saying water's a free-for-all and everybody can have what they want and do what they want with it. Because we're not saying that it should be privatized doesn't mean that we're saying there should be no rules to protect it.